Every morning for 37 years, Imani Akaffer woke up at 5:48 in the morning and made 1 cup of coffee. Not 2. 1. She poured exactly 6 ounces from the same drip machine she had owned since 1997, added no sugar and no cream, and carried the cup to the left side of her kitchen table, the side that faced the window that faced east. She read the arts and culture section of the newspaper first, before the front page, before sports, before anything. She folded it back the same direction her mother had taught her when she was 9 years old. She set her cup on the ring stain in the wood that had been there since 1991, and that she had stopped trying to remove sometime around 1994 because it had become, without her choosing it, a kind of landmark. And every morning for 37 years, 412 miles away in a rented house on the south side of Macon, Georgia, her twin sister Esther did exactly the same thing. Imani didn't know that. Esther didn't know it either. They had not spoken in 37 years. Not one letter, not one phone call, not one birthday card slipped under a door or left on a voicemail out of some midnight courage that ran out before morning. For 37 years, each woman had lived in the same country, in the same region, breathing the same air of the American Midwest and South, raising children who grew up within a few hours of each other, watching the same seasons turn, losing the same parents to age and illness, and neither had known a single thing about the other's daily life. Except for the coffee, the left side of the table, the east-facing window, the newspaper, arts and culture first. Some connections don't need permission to survive. Some of them simply wait. On a Thursday afternoon in November, both women walked through the doors of the Family Feud studio in Los Angeles, separately, through separate entrances, escorted by separate production assistants who had been briefed very carefully on the protocol. They had flown in on separate flights, stayed in separate hotels, eaten breakfast on separate floors of a building they did not know they both occupied. A producer named Teresa had spent 4 months arranging this. She had told almost no one. Steve Harvey had been told to expect something unusual. He did not know what it was. He had asked twice and been given the same answer both times. You'll know when it happens. He would know. There was no question about that. The question was whether any of them in that studio were going to be ready for what 37 years of silence looked like when it finally broke. The Thursday taping schedule at Family Feud runs on a rhythm that the crew has refined over many years into something close to a living organism. Not rigid, but alive, responsive, capable of flexibility while maintaining the underlying beat of what the show requires. Cameras at 7, lighting adjustments until 8:30, audience orientation beginning at 1:45, first family introductions at 2:15, warm-up comedian at 2:30, host entrance and first taping by 3. On the Thursday in late November that year, the production offices had a different atmosphere than usual. Not tense, not anxious, held, the specific quality of a room in which the people occupying it know something is coming and have agreed, without discussing it, that the knowing requires a certain stillness. Teresa had been in the building since 6:30. She was 41 years old and had been producing television for 15 years, and she would say later that this episode was the most complicated logistical undertaking of her professional life, not because the logistics were actually more complex than larger productions she had managed, but because the margin for error was human rather than technical. You can rewind a tape. You cannot rewind a moment between two sisters who haven't seen each other in 37 years. Everything had to go right the first time. She had rehearsed the staging with the floor team 7 times. She had briefed the camera operators individually, telling each of them which subject to stay on and when. She had spoken with Steve Harvey for 45 minutes the previous evening and had told him as much as she could without ruining it, which was to say, twins, separated 37 years, neither knows the other is here. When they see each other, let it breathe. Do not fill the silence, trust the room. Steve had listened. He had asked 2 questions. The first was, are both women okay? Teresa said yes. The second was, how long has it been since they've spoken? Teresa said 37 years. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. That was all he said. But the way he said it, slow, certain, the way a person accepts something that is going to require all of him, told Teresa everything she needed to know. The studio audience that afternoon had been given only a general orientation. This episode would include a moment they were not expecting, and they should feel free to react however they genuinely felt. Gerald, the warm-up comedian, had been told the same. For the first time in 11 years of doing the warm-up, Gerald had left his reserve material in his jacket pocket. He had decided, correctly, that whatever happened when both sisters saw each other would be larger than anything he could fill it with. He was going to stand in the wing and watch like everyone else. On the east side of the building, in the larger of the 2 green rooms, the Akaffer family. Imani Akaffer, 61 years old, retired after 30 years as a school principal in Akron, Ohio. She had run a K-8 school for the last 16 of those years, the kind of principal who knew every student's name within the first 2 weeks, who called parents herself, who sat at the same lunch table as the kids on Wednesdays. She was a woman who ran things, who arrived first and left last, who had the particular quality of organized, capable people. The ability to be calm in conditions that would rattle others, paired with the specific private cost that kind of calm requires. Her daughter Renata, 36, who had her mother's organizational mind and her father's ease with people, which made her formidable in a quiet way. Renata's husband Jerome, soft-spoken and quick with a laugh. Their daughter Chloe, 16, who had been vibrating with barely contained excitement since they had landed in Los Angeles, and who had told her grandmother this morning that she had a good feeling about today, which was technically true, and also perhaps the largest understatement Chloe had ever made in her 16 years. And Derek, 23, Renata's son, Imani's grandson, last in line, walking slightly apart from the group, with the expression of a man who has spent 8 months carrying a secret that has grown considerably heavier with each passing month, and is now, in the final hour before its release, almost physically present as a weight. Derek had submitted the application 8 months ago. He had told the family they had won a contest. He had maintained this fiction across 3 family dinners, 2 holiday gatherings, and 1 moment in February when his grandmother had looked at him over her coffee cup with a look so knowing that he had been certain, for 3 full seconds, that she had figured it out. She had not figured it out. She had just been looking at him with the look grandmothers give you when they love you. He had not been able to tell the difference, which said something about the weight of what he was carrying. On the west side of the building, in the smaller green room, the Calloway family. Esther Calloway, also 61, retired from 22 years as a hospital records administrator at a mid-size medical center in Macon, Georgia, where Imani was a principal in bearing as well as profession, organized, frontal, the kind of person who filled a room with competence. Esther was something slightly different. She was warm in the way that people who have spent decades managing pain on behalf of strangers become warm. By genuine necessity, by long practice, by understanding that the humans coming to her with their paperwork and their confusion and their fear were the center of the work, and the forms were just the scaffolding. Her son Marcus, 38. His wife Priscilla, who had been married to Marcus for 11 years and had heard about Imani twice in those 11 years, both times obliquely, in the way Esther mentioned things she had decided not to discuss. Their son Raymond, 35. And last, Lily, 18, Esther's granddaughter, the one who had started all of this. Lily had found Derek's contact information through a third cousin who appeared in both family trees, a discovery she had made at 17 during a period of intense genealogical curiosity that had been triggered by a DNA kit she received for her birthday. The kit had shown her in the clinical language of percentages that there were people she was related to that she had not known about. One of those people was in Akron, Ohio. She had sent a message to the account. Derek had answered within an hour. Lily had spent 8 months telling her grandmother they had won a sweepstakes. She and Derek had texted each other almost daily throughout this period. 2 cousins who had met exactly twice in their lives and had become, in the course of engineering, something much larger than either of them, something close to family. The 2 green rooms were separated by a hallway that neither family used. At 3:08 p.m., both families received the signal from their separate production assistants. It was time. Steve Harvey walked onto the main stage at 3:12. He wore a navy suit with a silver pocket square. He walked out to the audience's applause with the ease of a man who has done this 10,000 times and has chosen today to be fully present for this particular one. He stopped at center stage. He looked at the audience. "Before we bring out our families," he said, "I need to tell you something. This is not a regular episode." He paused. "What you are about to see has never happened on this stage before. I need everyone to hold their reaction until I give you the signal. Can you do that?" 200 people nodded. Steve looked at the wings. He nodded once. "Bring them in." To understand what the studio was about to hold, you have to go back further than 37 years. You have to go back to February 14, 1963, in Toledo, Ohio, and a woman named Josephine who was in labor for 11 hours and produced, at the end of it, 2 daughters in 3 minutes. She named the first one Imani, which in Swahili means faith. She named the second one Esther, which in Hebrew means star. Their father Bernard, a machinist who worked the day shift at a tool and die plant and spent his evenings growing tomatoes in the backyard and reading history books in the leather chair in the front room, looked at both daughters and said, to no one in particular, to the room, to whatever was listening, "We are going to need a bigger table." They were the third and fourth of 6 children. In a house that size, in a family that warm and that loud, twin daughters were not a disruption to the existing order so much as a confirmation that the order was larger than anyone had previously known. Everyone made room. Everyone adjusted. The table did get bigger. Bernard built an extension for it himself over a weekend in March, and the table had held the family's Sunday dinners for the next 40 years. Imani and Esther shared a room from birth until they were 17, at which point Esther moved into the room vacated by their older brother Curtis's departure for the Navy. But even across the hallway, the distance between them was notional. They were up late, whispering through walls. They borrowed each other's clothes without asking, which caused the only sustained, recurring argument of their childhood, a disagreement that resolved itself less through negotiation than through each sister gradually developing a style distinct enough that the other's clothes stopped being appealing. Imani went toward structure, organized, pressed, the kind of person whose bookshelf was alphabetical by the time she was 14. Esther went toward improvisation. She dressed by feel in the morning, kept her desk in a state that appeared chaotic to everyone else, and was apparently a filing system legible only to her, and had the gift of being genuinely comfortable with not knowing what was coming next. These were not incompatibilities. They were what happened when one person split into two and each half developed in its own direction while retaining the original center. The original center was this: they finished each other's sentences, not occasionally, habitually, not because they were performing something cute, but because the sentences were genuinely half-formed in both of them simultaneously, and the natural resolution was for whichever one opened her mouth first to get the first half and the other to supply the second. Their mother, Josephine, called it the twin language. Their father, Bernard, called it efficiency. Their younger siblings called it annoying and eventually stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a clock on the wall after the first week. They were not the same person. This was important, and they both knew it, and they both, when necessary, insisted on it. Imani did not like improvisation. Esther did not like alphabetical bookshelves. Imani cried at funerals. Esther cried at songs. Imani made decisions quickly and committed. Esther deliberated longer and occasionally changed her mind. They argued in the specific way of people who know exactly where all the soft spots are and have spent a lifetime mostly choosing not to press them, and occasionally not being able to help it. They loved each other with the kind of love that does not need to be explained because it predates the possibility of explanation. The rupture happened across a hospital room in 1987, in the spring of a year that had already been hard. Josephine Acaffer had been diagnosed with breast cancer in January. It was stage III. The oncologist presented 2 treatment paths, an aggressive protocol with significant side effects, or a more conservative approach that was less certain but more livable. Josephine, 63 years old, had listened to both options and had said she needed time. Imani, 24 and newly established in Akron, drove back to Toledo every weekend for 2 months. Esther, still in Toledo, was there every day. They were both frightened in the specific way of children watching a parent become mortal, which is to say completely, even when it didn't show on their faces. The disagreement was not about the medicine. It was about what love required. Imani believed that love required fighting, pushing, not accepting the conservative option when the aggressive one had a better statistical outcome. She believed, with the conviction of someone whose entire professional identity was built on getting things right, that her mother needed to be persuaded toward the treatment that gave her the best chance. Esther believed that love required listening. Her mother had heard the options, understood them, and had a right to make her own choice. Esther had spent enough time in hospitals, even then, to know that what patients needed most was not someone else's conviction, but someone else's presence. They said things in that hospital room that were the product of fear translated into anger, which is the most common translation fear makes. The words were specific and targeted in the way that only the words of someone who has known you since before you had words can be. Josephine Acaffer died in March of 1988. Both daughters were at the bedside. They sat on opposite sides, each holding one of their mother's hands, and did not speak to each other and did not look at each other. When it was over, Esther left the room first. Imani sat alone in the room for 22 minutes. That was the last time they had been in the same building. The years that followed were full ones for both of them. Imani married a man named Robert in 1990. They had 2 children, Renata in 1989 and a son named James in 1992. Robert died of a heart attack in 2003. James died in a car accident in 2009. These were the kinds of losses that changed the shape of a life permanently, not by breaking it, but by rearranging what it's built around. Imani had gone back to school after Robert died, completed her principal certification, and taken over the K-8 in Akron. She ran it for 16 years. She was the kind of principal the teachers trusted, the kind the students remembered, the kind whose retirement, when it came, produced a gymnasium full of people who had driven from different states to be there. She was, by any measure, a person who had done something real with her time. But she kept the left side of the kitchen table, the east-facing window, the single cup of coffee at 5:48 in the morning. She had never understood fully why she kept these things. They had been her mother's habits, carried into her own kitchen without ceremony. She had just never stopped doing them. Esther had moved to Macon in 1994 when Marcus's father relocated for work and had found a hospital records position that fit her precisely, structured enough to satisfy the part of her that her twin would have recognized, human enough to satisfy the rest. She had been good at it. She had also kept the same morning habits in the same order without knowing why, without knowing that 412 miles north the same cup was being lifted at the same time. The load-bearing object was not a single item. It was a pair. When Josephine Acaffer died, she had been wearing on her left wrist a thin gold bracelet that Bernard had given her on their 20th anniversary in 1971. Plain gold, no stones, a simple engraving on the inside of the curve. Together. In the weeks before she died, Josephine had asked the hospital chaplain to arrange for the bracelet to be cut. She wanted each daughter to have a piece of it. The chaplain had found a jeweler willing to come to the hospital. The cut was clean through the middle, each half retaining the original curve of the bracelet. Imani's half, Tojeth, Esther's half. Both halves were pressed into their daughter's hands at the memorial service, separately by the same chaplain. Neither sister knew that day what piece the other had received. Both wore their half every day for the next 37 years. Neither mentioned it to the other because there was no communication. Neither mentioned it to their own families because it was not a thing that needed explaining to people who already knew the shape of the grief it represented. Lily had seen her grandmother's bracelet her entire life. She had never asked about it. Then she did DNA testing at 17 and found Derek's contact information and sent a message and received an answer, and in the first real conversation they had said, "My grandmother has half of a gold bracelet she's worn every day as long as I can remember." Derek had been quiet for 30 seconds. "Half a bracelet," he said. "Curved, gold?" "Yes," Lily said, another pause. "So does mine," he said. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "What does yours say?" Lily asked. "Tojeth," Derek said, "it's cut off." Lily looked at the photo on her phone of her grandmother's wrist. She had taken it 3 months earlier without knowing why. She zoomed in, the engraving on her grandmother's half. She sent the photo to Derek. He was quiet for so long that she thought the connection had dropped. Then he said, "Okay, I have an idea, but it's going to take about 8 months. "Tell me," Lily said. He told her. She said yes before he was finished. Both families walked out from the wings at the same moment. The staging had been rehearsed precisely, both groups entering simultaneously from opposite sides, walking at the same pace toward the center of the stage. The lighting pulled the audience's eye toward the movement on each side equally, so there was no clear focal point, no way to know which entrance to watch. Teresa in the booth was watching the monitor that showed both camera feeds simultaneously. She had a stopwatch. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind more times than she could count. The families walked. Imani was first through the left wing, then Renata, Jerome, Chloe, Derek. On the right, Marcus, Priscilla, Raymond, Lily, Esther. For the first 4 steps, neither woman saw the other. There was simply too much to take in. The audience, the lights, the cameras, Steve Harvey at center stage, the particular overwhelming sensory experience of walking onto a television set for the first time in your life and trying to orient yourself within it. Then Imani turned her head. She couldn't have said why. There was no specific trigger. Something in her peripheral vision had moved in a way that was familiar at a frequency below the level of conscious recognition. The way you react to a sound you didn't consciously register, the body moving before the mind arrives. She turned. She looked across 30 feet of studio floor. She saw a woman emerging from the opposite wing. Imani's feet stopped, completely. No gradual slowing, no decision visible in her body. Her feet simply stopped, as if the signal from her legs had been interrupted by something upstream. Renata, 1 step ahead, turned back. Across the stage, the woman from the opposite wing had also stopped. They stood there, 2 women 61 years old, identical in the way that 37 years reshapes identical twins into their own separate selves while leaving enough of the original geometry that anyone looking carefully would know. Same height, same quality of stillness. Same way of holding themselves when something had surprised them past the point of managed reaction. The audience had been told to hold its reaction. The audience made a sound. It was not a gasp and it was not silence. It was the sound that 200 people make simultaneously when they arrive at understanding at the same instant, a kind of collective intake, the sound of a room catching its breath together. Steve Harvey, at center stage, did not move. He had been watching both wings since the families began entering, and he was watching now, and he had the look of a man who has been told something is coming and still is not ready for it. It was Esther who moved first. She took one step forward, then another. Then she stopped again because her body was managing several things at once, and forward motion was not, in this moment, the easiest of them. Imani put her hand over her mouth. The camera operator in the center position, who had been given specific instructions to stay on Imani's face during this moment, would say later that she almost missed the shot because her own hands were shaking. "Esther," Imani said, not loud, barely above breath. "The name of someone you haven't spoken in 37 years and have said in your head more times than you could count." Esther closed her eyes. 1 second, just one. Then she opened them. "Manny," she said, the childhood name. The one that had existed between them before any other name, before the school names and the professional names and the names that the world knew them by. The one that only one person alive had ever called her. Imani's tears came without announcement. Not the photogenic kind, not one at a time, telegraphed. The real kind, fast and indiscriminate, the kind that arrive when the body has released the management contract and is simply responding to what is true. Behind Imani, Chloe, 16 years old, who had known for 3 weeks and had thought she was prepared, found that she had not been prepared. She put both hands over her face. Derek, at the back of the group, stood completely still with his hands at his sides, watching his grandmother, his face doing something complicated that was not quite crying and not quite not crying, and was the specific expression of someone who has spent 8 months working toward a moment, and is now watching the moment exist in reality rather than in planning, and discovering that reality is much larger. Neither woman moved toward the other yet. They stood in their separate pools of stage light and looked at each other across 30 feet and 37 years, and the distance between them was simultaneously a measurable physical fact, and something much larger than any physical fact. Steve Harvey let the moment breathe for 12 full seconds. He counted them later. He said he had never let 12 seconds pass on a live stage without saying something, and that these 12 seconds were the most important ones he had ever hosted. "Take your time," he said. His voice was quiet, just 2 words. Imani walked. She walked toward her sister across the studio floor, and Esther walked toward her, and they met at the exact center of the stage, exactly halfway, as if the geometry had been agreed upon, as if some measurement that neither of them had consciously made had been operating in them all along. They held each other. And Steve Harvey said, "Now!" And the audience released what it had been holding. The sound was enormous. It was warm and full, and it filled the studio from the floor to the grid and bounced back down, and the people making it didn't stop making it until they were ready to stop, which took a while. Gerald, the warm-up comedian, stood in the left wing with his hands clasped in front of him and did not say a single word. Steve Harvey stood at center stage and felt something he would later in an interview describe simply as, "I understood why I do this job." But the room didn't know yet what was still coming. The most extraordinary thing about that afternoon had not happened yet. It was still ahead of them. It took 14 minutes for both families to settle enough to begin. Steve Harvey did not call it dead air. He did not apologize for it to the audience. He let it breathe because he had understood from his conversation with Teresa the night before that the event itself was the content and the format was secondary. The production did not cut to commercial. Teresa's voice in his earpiece said, "Stay with it." He stayed. In those 14 minutes, cousins who had met twice met again for real. Lily and Derek stood beside each other at the edge of the family groupings and had the particular look of people who have successfully completed something enormous and are only now beginning to feel the weight of what they carried. "How long did you keep this secret?" Steve asked them once the families had arranged themselves on opposite sides of the stage and both sisters were standing composed with the particular composure of people who have been through something large and have steadied themselves on the other side of it. 8 months, Derek said. Steve looked at him. 8 months. "Yes, sir. And your grandmother didn't know the whole time?" "She looked at me once in February," Derek said, "and I was certain she knew. She just looked at me." Steve Harvey turned to Imani. "Did you know?" Imani looked at her grandson. "I looked at him in February and I thought, something is going on with this boy, but I assumed it was girl trouble." Derek dropped his head. The audience laughed, the warm, relieved laugh of people who have been through something emotional and are grateful for the permission to exhale. "This show," Steve said to the audience, gesturing at both families, has been running for a long time. I have seen families come in here and do extraordinary things. I have seen people surprise each other and surprise themselves and surprise me. He shook his head. But I have never, in all those years, watched two identical twin sisters walk onto this stage not knowing the other one was here. He paused. And I have never cried during a taping before, so that's a new thing for me today. He had. The camera had caught it during the embrace, not a full break in composure, but the eyes doing the thing eyes do when the management has briefly stopped working. The game format was explained. The producers had made one adjustment. For every face-off question throughout the episode, both sisters would stand at the center podiums, not rotating with other family members. Every face-off, Imani and Esther opposite each other. "Is that all right with both of you?" Steve asked. Imani and Esther looked at each other from across the stage. "That's fine," Imani said. "That's fine," Esther said, simultaneously, exactly. The same flat, certain cadence, the same three words, no measurable gap between them. A ripple moved through the audience, laughter and something warmer than laughter, recognition of something they had just witnessed that they didn't have full words for. Steve Harvey looked at the audience. He looked at the sisters. He looked at the audience again. "Did you hear that?" he said. "Did everybody hear that?" The audience confirmed that they had. "We're already doing this," Steve said to the sisters with genuine wonder. "You've been apart for 37 years and we're already doing this." "We used to do it all the time," Esther said. "You just remember the words before the other one says them." "You stop noticing," Imani said. "After a while, it was how we talked." The first round began. Steve Harvey read the first face-off question. "Name something people always find in a doctor's waiting room." Both sisters moved for the buzzer simultaneously. Imani was faster by a fraction. "Old magazines," she said. Number one answer, 44 points. The Akafer family ran the round cleanly. Renata and Jerome and Chloe and Derek answered in succession, banking well, finishing with 93 points. Then the Calloway family had their rotation, and Esther led it face off. "Name a reason a person might leave a party early." Esther hit the buzzer. "They weren't really feeling it to begin with." Steve Harvey turned to the board. Number one answer, 52 points. The audience responded to this with the particular energy of people who are discovering they enjoy watching a specific kind of intelligence at work. The game progressed through its first two rounds, both families competitive, both sisters fast and sure at the face-off positions. And then gradually, across 5 questions, and then 7, the thing began. No one in the room could point to the exact question where they first saw it clearly. It built the way patterns build, invisible until the third repetition, at which point it seemed as if it had always been there. On a question about what people do when they cannot sleep, Imani said, "Read." And the reaction camera caught Esther across the stage moving her lips to form the same word at the same moment. On a question about birthday traditions, Esther said cake with candles, and the camera caught Imani's lips shaping the same 4 words in the same instant. The audience began to notice. You could feel it in the room, the attention sharpening in a specific direction, the way attention does when it has identified a pattern and wants to see if the pattern holds. Then the face-off that made everyone understand this was not coincidence. Steve read the question. Name something a teacher always keeps on her desk. Both sisters went for the buzzer. The system gave it to Imani by a margin the floor judge had to verify. Imani opened her mouth. "An apple," she said. Esther, 6 feet away at the opposite podium, said, "An apple." Same 2 words, same moment. Before Imani's answer had registered as sound in the room, the audience was quiet for 2 full seconds. Then it was not quiet. A woman in the 4th row grabbed the arm of the man beside her and said something that the microphone didn't catch, but that her body language made clear. A man in the back stood up and sat back down and stood up again. The camera trained on Steve Harvey's face captured the exact instant his composure gave. Not into tears, not into laughter. Into something more precise than either, the open, unguarded expression of a man who has encountered something he genuinely cannot categorize and has stopped trying. His mouth opened. His head tilted slightly to the left. He said, "Wait." Just that word, just the one. "Wait," he pointed at Esther. "You said it at the same time. Before she finished saying it, you said it." Esther looked at Imani. Imani looked at Esther. "We used to do this," Imani said quietly. "All the time," Esther said, together. Same moment, same words. The audience erupted for the second time. Steve Harvey looked at the camera. He turned back to the sisters. He put both hands up, not in surrender, in the gesture of a man who has reached the edge of his available frameworks and is choosing to acknowledge it rather than pretend otherwise. "What," he said slowly to the room, "is happening on this stage right now?" Steve Harvey called a pause, not a formal production timeout, just a human pause. He walked to center stage, looked at the audience, and said, "I need a moment, I need a moment." The audience laughed warmly, so did both families. I have been doing this show for a long time, Steve said. I have seen families do things on this stage that I did not believe were possible, and I have never, he looked at both sisters. I have never watched two people finish each other's answers before one of them had given it. I need someone to explain this to me. He looked at Esther specifically. You said an apple before you could have heard her say an apple. How did you do that? Esther considered this with the thoughtfulness of someone who has not had to explain something to another person before because it was simply always a given. I don't know, she said honestly. We stopped noticing we were doing it when we were children. It was just, she looked at Imani. It was just the way we talked, the way we thought. But you've been apart for 37 years, Steve said. I know, Esther said, and it just came back like it never stopped. Imani and Esther looked at each other. Came back, they said, together. Steve closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them and looked at the audience. See, when I say I need a moment, I am not being dramatic. The laughter helped the room breathe. All right, Steve said. We are going to keep playing this game because I genuinely need to see what happens next. But first, I want to talk to you two for a minute, because we came in here knowing the broad shape of this story, and I don't think we know the full shape yet. He pulled his stool to center stage and sat on it, which was not a thing he typically did. It lowered the register of the room. It made the space smaller. Tell me about the 37 years, he said, not to one of them, to both of them. What came out of that conversation, extended, unhurried, the production letting it run, was the texture of two lives lived in parallel without awareness of each other. Imani told him about Robert, about James. She said it plainly the way she had learned to say it. My son James passed in 2009, a car accident. Steve Harvey said, I'm sorry. Thank you, Imani said. Across the stage, Esther went very still. The camera operator on her held the shot. Teresa in the booth put her hand on the arm of the monitor technician and said quietly, Stay on her. Steve noticed. He was very good at noticing. Esther, he said. She looked up. Something was moving across her face that the audience could see but not name. It was not simple grief. It was the specific, more complicated grief of someone learning about a loss they should have been present for and were not. I didn't know, she said. The studio was quiet. I didn't know about James, Esther said. Was looking at Imani, just at Imani. I didn't know you had lost a son. Imani looked at her sister. The decades in the room between them were suddenly not an abstraction. I thought about calling you, Imani said. Her voice was careful and still. When James died, I picked up the phone. I held it for a while. Why didn't you? Esther asked. The question was not an accusation. It was an honest question asked by someone who needed the honest answer. I was afraid you wouldn't answer, Imani said. I would have answered, Esther said immediately. Then more quietly, I would always have answered. I know, Imani said. I think I always knew that. I was afraid of what it meant if you did answer, of opening everything up again. Easier to grieve alone, Esther said. Easier, Imani agreed. Not easier, safer. Steve Harvey had set his question card down on his podium during this exchange. He was not hosting. He was bearing witness, which was the other thing this stage required sometimes. Then Esther reached for her left wrist. She unclasped the bracelet, the half bracelet curved and plain and gold that she had been wearing every day since March of 1988. She held it up in the studio light. Across the stage, Imani made a sound, not a word, a sound, the involuntary kind. Her hand went to her own left wrist. She unclasped hers, held it up. Two curved pieces of the same bracelet, separated for 37 years, now visible in the same room. The woman in the fourth row who had grabbed the man beside her arm earlier said, audibly, "Oh my God!" A sound technician at the stage's left edge stepped back against the wall. Lily in the back of the Calloway group was crying without sound, tears running straight down without the usual preparation the face makes before crying, because she had been managing this knowledge for 8 months and the management had run out. What does it say? Steve Harvey asked. His voice was very quiet. Imani turned hers. Tojith, she said. Esther turned hers. Steve Harvey did not speak for 12 seconds. Nobody counted them. They simply were. Then he said very quietly to the room, their mother split a gold bracelet between them when she died, half for each daughter, and both women wore their half every single day, for 37 years without knowing the other still wore hers. He looked up at the ceiling briefly, then back at both sisters. We are not finished with this story. We are nowhere near finished. Steve Harvey crossed to center stage. He stood in the open space between both families, equidistant, and he looked at Imani on his left and Esther on his right, and when he spoke his voice had come down to a register that was not performing. I want to ask both of you something before we go further, he said, and I want you to know there's no right answer. This is not a game question. This is me asking, as one person to two others, as honestly as I can. Both women waited. Is there anything you need to say to each other that hasn't been said? The silence that followed was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who had arrived at a place they had been walking toward for a very long time and were taking one last breath before stepping in. Imani spoke first. "I owe you an apology," she said. She looked at Esther and only at Esther. "What I said in that hospital room in 1987, the things I said about your choices, about how you were handling Mom's care, about what you were willing to do for her, those were not fair things. They were not true things. They were the things fear says when fear doesn't have anywhere else to go." She paused. She was not using the careful principal's voice. She was using her own. "I knew when I said them that you were doing what you believed was right. I knew you loved her as much as I did. I couldn't be afraid without being angry, and you were the closest person to me in that room, and I aimed it at you." She stopped. "I have wanted to say that for 37 years. I have started to say it in my head more times than I can count. I never knew how to find the opening." Esther was quiet for a moment. "You know what I used to tell Marcus when he was growing up," Esther said. Her voice was steady. Steady in the specific way of someone who has already cried the required amount and is on the other side of it now. "I used to tell him that the people who can hurt you the most are the ones who know you best, because they know exactly where to put the words." She looked at Imani. "I knew you didn't mean to be cruel. I knew it was fear. I've known it for 37 years. What I didn't do was let you know that I knew, because I was also afraid." "Of what?" Imani said. "Of the same thing as you. Of opening the door and finding out it was too late. Of calling and having you not answer. Of calling and having you answer and neither of us knowing what to say after so long." "So neither of us called," Imani said. "So neither of us called," Esther agreed. A moment. "That was a mistake," Imani said. "Yes," Esther said. "It was." It was not a recrimination. It was an accounting, two people looking at a 37-year fact and naming it plainly together, the way the sisters had once finished sentences, not as antagonism but as completion. Esther crossed the stage. This time she did not stop. She walked from one side to the other, fully without hesitation, because the hesitation had been held for 37 years and it was finished now. She stopped in front of her sister. She held out her left wrist. Imani held out hers. Both half bracelets up, both curved pieces of their mother's gold side by side. "Give them to me," Steve Harvey said. He held out both hands. Both women unclasped their bracelets and placed them in his palms. He brought the two pieces together, carefully, feeling for the alignment, the way you feel for the fit of a thing that was always meant to be whole, until the edges met and the engraving completed itself in his hands. Together. He turned his palms up and showed the audience. The sound in the studio was not the sound of a correct answer, and it was not the sound of a reunion, and it was not the sound of a moment on a game show. It was the sound of 200 people all feeling the same thing in their chests at the same time, and having to let it out through the only channel available, which was their voices. Steve Harvey stood at the center of it. He held the complete bracelet for a long moment. Then he walked to both sisters and placed the two halves back, one in Imani's hand, one in Esther's. "Your mother knew," he said. "She always knew," Esther said. "She split it on purpose," Steve said. "She gave you each a half so that the bracelet was only whole when you were in the same place." Imani looked at the curved piece in her hand. "She was always smarter than either of us," she said. "Most mothers are," Steve said. He stepped back. He looked at both families. He looked at Derek and Lily. He looked at the audience. "Now," he said, and his voice shifted gently back toward the hosting register, the way you close a door softly because there is something important in the room beside it. "We have a game to finish, and I want to see what these two do with the rest of it." The final rounds had a different quality. Both families competed genuinely. The Callaway team had been closing the gap, and entering the final rotation the margin was tight enough that either family could take it. The audience, which had been through a full afternoon of feeling things, had settled into a warm, invested attentiveness. Not the anticipation of people waiting for the next surprise, but the attention of people who have arrived somewhere they are glad to be and want to stay present. And the finishing continued. That was the word Teresa would use later. The finishing, because it was not exactly simultaneous answering. It was something more specific, one sister beginning a thought and the other completing it, not as interruption, but as the natural resolution of a sentence that had always been shared. On a question about what makes a house feel like home, Imani buzzed and said, "Good smells from the," and Esther, unprompted, said, "Kitchen." At the same instant, Imani said, "Kitchen." On a question about what people keep from their childhood, Esther buzzed and said, "Photographs," and Imani completed, "Letters from people who are gone." Steve Harvey stopped the game at this point, not because the format required it, but because he needed to address what was happening. "Okay," he said to the audience. "I need us all to acknowledge something. She is finishing the sentence before the sentence is finished. She's providing the second half of a thought that her sister started and has not completed yet." He pointed at both sisters. This is not something people do. This is not a thing that exists. It's a twin thing, Imani said. It's us thing, Esther said. Since we were about 7, Imani said. Since before that, Esther said. Before what? Imani said. Before 7, we were doing it at 4, Manny. You remember being 4? I remember you finishing my sentences at 4. Well, you started it. You were born first. By 3 minutes. 3 minutes is enough to be the one who starts things. Steve Harvey turned to the audience with the expression of a man watching something ancient and specific and fully intact reassemble itself in real time. They've been apart for 37 years, he said. 37, and this, he gestured at both sisters. This is just still here. The audience understood. The audience had been understanding all afternoon. But this was the version that landed in the chest rather than behind the eyes. The version that was not about reunion or forgiveness or a gold bracelet, but about something more fundamental. The thing you were built with, built out of, built alongside, does not leave just because the years put distance between it. The final face-off came down to a tie-breaking question, both families level, everything resting on one answer. Steve Harvey brought both sisters to the center podiums. They stood across from each other, both left wrists bearing their halves of the bracelet. Tojeth and 4 feet apart. Steve looked at both of them for a long time. Name the most important thing a family can give you. Neither moved for a beat. Then both went for the buzzer simultaneously. The system gave it to Imani by a fraction. She looked at her sister. Do you want to say it at the same time? Imani said. Esther almost laughed. You already know what I'm going to say. You know what I'm going to say? Yes. Then on 3, Esther nodded. Imani looked at Steve. On 3, Steve Harvey counted. 1, 2, 3. Unconditional love, both sisters said. Same words, same breath, same moment. Steve Harvey turned to the board. The #1 survey answer was unconditional love, 61 points. The Acaffer family won the round. Fast money followed, with Renata at the podiums, steady and warm, banking 223 points, well above the 200 threshold. The Acaffer family had won $25,000. The announcement was correct, and it mattered, and it also was, in a certain specific sense, beside the point. The room was not in prize territory anymore. It was somewhere else. Steve Harvey came to center stage with both families gathered around him. I've been asked a lot of times, he said, what this show is about. And I say it's about families, about the survey answers that tell us what ordinary people think and value and do. He paused. Today I found out something that the survey can't measure. I found out that certain connections don't require maintenance to survive. They go quiet. They wait. They wear half a bracelet every morning for 37 years without knowing the other half is being worn 400 miles away. He looked at both sisters. And when the conditions are right, when 2 young people who never should have found each other somehow do find each other and spend 8 months building the most elaborate, loving, impractical plan I have ever heard of, those connections come back. Whole, like nothing interrupted them. He looked at Derek and Lily. You 2 gave your grandmothers back to each other. That is not a small thing. That is not something most people do in a lifetime. You did it at 23 and 18. Don't you ever let anyone tell you the young ones don't understand what matters. Derek was looking at the floor. Lily had both hands over her face. Neither of them was managing to hold it together, which was the right response to what had just been said about them. The applause lasted a long time. And at the center of it, Imani Acaffer and Esther Calloway stood together with their wrists touching, Tojeth pressed against and said nothing, because the sentence had always been shared between them and the sentence was complete. After the taping, both families went to dinner. Teresa had reserved a private room at a restaurant 3 blocks from the studio. The reservation was for 12, and when they arrived it felt slightly too small and exactly right. Imani sat next to Esther. Not across from her, next to her on the same side of the table. They did not talk constantly, which confused no one who understood what was happening. They had been talking every day in parallel for 61 years and had simply not been in the same room for 37 of them. Being in the room was already a conversation. Derek and Lily sat at the far end of the table and were louder than anyone else. They reenacted at full volume and with considerable dramatization the various close calls of the 8 months. The February evening when Derek was certain his grandmother had figured it out. The 3-way group chat where someone's autocorrect had nearly spelled out the surprise. The phone call in September when both cousins talked over each other so completely that neither could remember afterward who had said which half of what. That, Esther said from down the table, is genetic. Completely genetic, Imani agreed. Both families stayed until the restaurant needed the room. In the months that followed, the sisters talked every morning, not every few days, every morning beginning the week after the taping at 5:48 a.m. Neither of them planned this. They simply both called at the same time on the first morning, and then the second, and by the third morning they had each worked out independently that 5:48 was when the other called, and by the fourth morning they had not discussed it, but it was simply the time. "You're at the left side of the table," Imani said on the third call. Esther paused. "How did you know that? The light's different in your voice. Is your window facing east?" A longer pause. "Yes," Esther said. "Mine too. Mama's kitchen." "Mama's kitchen," Imani said. "We both took it with us." "She knew we would," Esther said. "She was always setting things up 3 steps ahead." "She was," Imani said. "The bracelet, the window, the coffee. She put things in us without telling us," Esther said, "and we just kept doing them." "Thought they were ours," Imani said. "They are ours," Esther said. "She gave them to us, that's how it works." The bracelet was restored in December. Chloe had found a jeweler in Akron, a woman named Margaret, 40 years in the craft, who took both halves and examined the cut point and confirmed the 2 pieces could be rejoined with a seam requiring magnification to see. She worked for 2 days. At Christmas, the first Christmas both families spent together in Imani's house in Akron, 14 people around the table that Bernard had built an extension for and that Imani had kept for 30 years after her parents died, Chloe placed the restored bracelet in a small box in the center of the table. Both sisters opened it together. They passed it back and forth. Each held it whole. The weight of it was different whole than half, not heavier, just different, more complete. The seam that Margaret had made was nearly invisible in the holiday light. "You take it the first year," Esther said to Imani. "It's both of ours. Then we need a system." They worked one out over Christmas dinner while 14 people around the table listened, alternating years indefinitely. Imani first, Esther second, back and forth, the bracelet that had been 2 pieces for 37 years now moving between 2 east-facing windows and 2 cups of morning coffee made one at a time. Josephine Acaffer had the word together engraved on a gold bracelet in 1971 because it was their anniversary and it was what she wanted to say. She had split it in 1988 because she was dying and she knew her daughters were about to break apart, and she wanted them to have something that could only be complete in the same room. She had known this. Mothers who are dying know things. She had not known about the game show. She had not known about Derek and Lily and the DNA kit and the 8 months of careful, patient, loving planning. But she had known her daughters. She had known what they were made of and what they were capable of and what they needed from each other that no one else on earth could provide. She had split the bracelet so they would always have a reason to find their way back. They took 37 years, but they came back. Whole. Some connections don't require permission to last. Some of them simply wait, wearing their half of something on the left side of a table facing east at 5:48 in the morning. And one day the other half calls. If this story stayed with you, if there is someone you've let time carry farther than you meant to let it go, subscribe. We find stories like this every week. The ones that wait 37 years and come back whole. The ones that remind you what's still there, what's been there all along. You don't want to miss what comes next.